In Chapter 7, we begin to look at perhaps one of the most important topics in all of economics, and that's the idea of economic growth. What we want to understand with economic growth is essentially why are some nations rich and why are some nations not. I think it's important to understand off the top, right, that poverty has been the historical norm for human beings. It's the wrong question to ask, why are people poor? Poverty is the sort of natural state of humanity. For thousands and tens of thousands of years, human beings were dirt poor, almost all of us. The exceptional thing, the thing we need to explain, is why, particularly in the last, say, 250 years, have some parts of the world become extraordinarily well off, and why have other parts of the world done reasonably well. And then we can perhaps ask the question, okay, why hasn't this spread all across the globe? One of the things you need to know is that one of the great accomplishments of the last 25 years is the reduction in global poverty. We've seen the number of people living on less than $1 or $2 a day drop dramatically over the last 25 years. And this is one of the most amazing accomplishments of humanity, that more and more people are able to live better and better this way. And one of the things people sort of sometimes say is, well, why is that? Economic growth, it's just stuff, it's just material goods. Why do we care about it? Well, the fact is that while it is true in the sense that that's what economic growth is measuring, what economic growth brings with it, and the wealth it brings with it, makes people better off. For example, wealthier nations have higher infant survival rates, higher life expectancies, better nutrition. They have more educational opportunity, more leisure, more entertainment. They have more equality between men and women. They also have more equality income equality as well. They also have fewer conflicts. There's fewer civil wars and riots in wealthy countries, and obviously more material goods. All of those things, though, it's all of those things that matter, right? What we care about, and what economists care about or should care about, is how does economic growth improve people's lives? Things like higher infant survival rates, life expectancy, nutrition, literacy rates, equality. All those kind of things that we're talking about, right? Those are the things that ultimately matter. And the reason we care about economic growth is that economic growth brings those things with it. And you can see when you have a chance to watch the supplemental videos for this chapter, you'll see all kinds of other evidence of that. But for now, right, at the point I want to make these 2 points. Again, this notion of growth and wealth and well-being that we're talking about is the exception historically. Historically, humanity has been impoverished. So when we think about economic growth, what are we thinking about, right? One of the things we might point out from the beginning is that living in the United States, we are among the world's wealthiest countries. We do very well. Meanwhile, if we look at, say, less than $3 per day, we're talking about still 1 billion people less than $3 per day, though, again, many have improved from under 2 or under 1. And much of the world's population is still living in conditions and at levels of economic well-being less, of course, significantly less than the developed Western world. And so one of the things we might want to think about is, how do we bring the rest of the world up to where we are, to where Western Europe is, to where Canada is, and so forth. The other thing we might want to think about here is how we think. What are the sort of terms that we use to talk about this? And when we talk about economic growth, we're talking about the growth rate of real GDP per capita. That's what we care about, right? Which is real GDP, again, accounting for inflation, and GDP is our measure per capita, per person. That's what tells us as we watch real GDP per capita change over time. That's our indicator of growth or of negative growth. One thing to keep in mind, though, is even slow growth, right, over time. It doesn't have to be huge growth taking place. 2%, 3% per year will produce large gains in wealth over enough time. It's what we call compounding, right, or exponential growth, and it's the same sort of phenomenon we see with interest rates on the other side. Even a low rate of interest, if you're paying a low rate of interest on a loan and it compounds over time, the loan, what you're paying, gets bigger. Or earning interest on a bank account, right, over time, it gets bigger. One of the things that we use to sort of talk about estimate economic growth is what's known as the Rule of 70. And the Rule of 70 approximates the length of time you need for a growing variable to double. And the Rule of 70 simply says something like the following: any growth, the growth of a country will double, right, we can estimate the time it will take for that growth to double by taking 70 and dividing it by the annual growth rate in percentage terms. So, for example, what we can say is if a country's growing at 2% per year, we take 70 divided by 2, right, for 2% per year, we get 35. That would mean in 35 years, the size of that country's economy would roughly double. So the rule of 70 tells us, right, that 70 divided by the growth rate will tell us how many years it would take for that country's wealth or whatever variable we're measuring to double. So, the example from the PowerPoint: if real GDP per capita is growing at an annual rate of 3.5%, it will double in 20 years. 70 divided by 3.5. This is kind of a rule of thumb, a sort of estimation and approximation, but it's interesting to look at, right? If you think about it, 3% per year, right? How long would it take for an economy to double at 3% per year? Something in the roughly 25-year range, 22, 23-year range. So that's not long, right? That's less than a generation, even at 2%. 35 years, not that long time for that to happen. As the book also points out, we can talk about what we call growth miracles and growth disasters. We certainly have a number of examples of countries that have grown very, very quickly. Japan after World War II, South Korea after World War II, or certainly after 1950, are good stories of growth miracles. The South Korea case is particularly interesting for some reasons we'll talk about in a little bit, right? But we can also talk about growth disasters. One example since 1950 is Nigeria, which was as poorer in 2005 than it was in 1974. Another story is Argentina. Early in the 20th century, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world, and by 1950 and then by 2000, it fallen even more. And today, of course, we look at Venezuela, which at one time was doing very well and has now become a classic growth disaster. So when we think about growth, when we think about the wealth of nations, we want to think about what the causes are. Okay, what are the things that lead countries to be wealthier than others? And really, we can focus on sort of two categories of things. The first set of things we'll talk about are sort of what we might call the immediate causes of economic growth. And really here, there are three things that matter, what we call the factors of production. That is physical capital, human capital, and technical knowledge. Those are the three things that we know are sort of directly related, immediately related to economic growth. And so we can define these the following way. Physical capital is the stock of tools that we use to produce things, machines, structures, equipment, right? All of that kind of stuff, right? From a hammer to the machine that helps and the robots that crank out automobiles. Those are all physical capital. Those are the physical stuff. Human capital are the productive knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. Right now, you're in college taking courses. You are augmenting your human capital. You are attempting to acquire more productive knowledge and skills, in this case through education, but we also get it through training, right? When you're on the job training and things like that, and also through experience. Just years of work can give us knowledge and skills that we wouldn't have otherwise. Human capital, therefore, is the productive knowledge and skills that workers acquire through education, training, and experience. And so when we think about what helps make a country rich, we have to think about both of those things. It's not just technology. It's not just physical stuff. It's also how educated, how well-trained, how experienced is the workforce. And so when we focus on the importance of education, one of the things we frequently talk about is all other things equal, a more educated population has more human capital, and countries with that, all other things equal, are likely to be better off. Now again, there's no guarantee. Education doesn't guarantee, human capital doesn't guarantee that. A good example of that's the former Soviet Union, which was largely well-educated. There were a lot of well-educated people in the Soviet Union, but their growth rates were terrible. They had a difficult time transforming their human capital and their physical capital into meaningful economic growth, into economic growth that actually benefited people. Okay, so again, in those factors, technical knowledge, human capital, physical capital, technical knowledge, right, are good to have, all other things equal, but they don't guarantee that you'll grow. And again, when we think about technical or technological knowledge, again, knowledge about how the world works, right, that's used to produce goods and services. You can have scientific knowledge here, for example, and certainly here too, improved technological knowledge all the things equal, will generate more economic growth. In the United States, for example, U.S. farms, because of their better technological knowledge, have increased output by 2.5 times since 1950 while using less land. But the problem is, if you can have all kinds of machines and all kinds of smart people, and they can know a lot about the world, but unless you can organize them, unless you can bring them together in ways that actually lead to producing things that benefit the population, that benefit us as consumers, you're not going to get economic growth, right? And so the organization of those factors of production was what matters. And those depend on sort of more ultimate causes of economic growth, in particular incentives and institutions. Now, if you think back to early on in the semester when we were talking about the big ideas in economics, these are two things we talked about. Incentives matter, and institutions were two of those ideas. And so here they are back again, and here's why they're important. As we said back then, institutions are the rules of the game that structure economic incentives. What we want is a world in which those rules of the game, those institutions, generate good incentives and provide good knowledge feedback to people in order to make the right kinds of decisions to generate economic growth. Okay? So what do we mean by institutions? Again, laws, regulations, but also customs, practices, organizations, social mores, anything that seems like a rule of the game that structures the way we interact with each other. Okay? And to sort of think back to, again, some things we talked about in that very first chapter, institutions that promote growth are ones that create incentives that align self-interest with social interest. That is, good institutions, ones that promote economic growth, enable people to pursue their self-interest and in doing so benefit others. Again, the example of sort of something like Apple Computers is the best one, right? You can be pursuing your self-interest, trying to make a profit selling these products, and in doing so, how are you going to do that? You have to create value. You have to create goods and services that people want to buy. That makes their lives better off. You profit by it. Self-interest is aligned with social interest. The wealthiest countries, the most successful countries, have institutions that make it in people's self-interest to invest in the physical capital, the human capital, the technological knowledge, right? And to find ways to organize that so that they get used well. Again, the problem in, say, something like the former Soviet Union was those pieces were there, but there was not a system by which they could be organized. In the United States, right, we had market economy, which enables us to do that. The Soviet Union didn't have that really, and therefore a lot of those resources were wasted. So what are the key institutions of economic growth that we might talk about? As the textbook points out, there are 5 key ones. I'm going to sort of list them and say just a quick word about each of them. Property rights, honest government, political stability, a dependable legal system, and competitive and open markets. So let me, again, just say a quick word about each. Property rights are crucial. People have to know that the things that they own are theirs and will continue to be theirs, and that if someone tries to take it from them, that they won't be able to do so, and that includes, by the way, government taking from them. So having secure property rights, clear, enforced, and secure property rights is important. You're not going to invest in things that take time to generate output unless you know you can reap the benefits of that. Honest government. You need what we frequently call the rule of law. You need people in government to be enforcing the law, enforcing it honestly. Corruption undermines the ability to invest it for long term. It undermines people's confidence in all kinds of other institutions. So honest government's key. Political stability, similar. If you have governments changing all the time, the military takes over, you go from one sort of democracy to a different form, or you go to socialism for 2 years and then back, right? All that instability makes it very hard for people to invest and to engage in the activities that we know generate economic growth. A dependable legal system, you need to know what the law is, it needs to be clear, it needs to be enforced fairly, and you need judges who are honest and not bribable and so on. You need to know that if the law is broken, and particularly if sort of your interests are harmed, that the law will take care of that. And finally, competitive and open markets. right? You can't be doling out favors. You can't have crony capitalism. You can't have all of those kind of things. You have to have a world in which it's easy for people to enter markets and compete with other producers. That is certainly a key element of economic growth. And being open to trade across the globe is important as well. So again, the book has a lot more to say about those, and you can look at some of the supplemental videos for this chapter to see more. The last point I want to make is that we really can't talk about economic growth without talking about the Industrial Revolution. There is a reason why when you look at several of the graphs in this chapter and in the videos that go with it, you see economic growth sort of flatlines and then suddenly takes off in the early to mid 19th century, 1800s. Right? We've had now about sort of 200 years of this growth. What happened? Well, the Industrial Revolution happened. And again, it's a really interesting and fascinating question about what caused the Industrial Revolution. Why did it happen in Great Britain as opposed to other parts of the world? But what we do know is that the change in how people thought about markets, the change in people how they talked about markets, the changes in institutions. We got more stable property rights, for example. We had more free and open markets. That all of these things all of those were joint causes of all coming together at roughly the same time to produce what we call the Industrial Revolution. And living standards since the Industrial Revolution have jumped dramatically. You might be thinking, well, weren't conditions during the Industrial Revolution terrible? Kids working in factories, working long days, right, under horrible conditions and so forth. And that is true to some extent, absolutely. But a couple things to consider. First of all, children have always worked. They worked on farms before the Industrial Revolution, before they worked in factories. Probably we just didn't see them. They were out in the country and we didn't see it. But now, move to the city, work in a factory, we see kids working, and we saw the conditions and so forth. It bothered us. The other part to remember is the conditions in the factory weren't great, but for most people viewed them as better than being working outside for 12, 14 hours a day in the rain or the heat or the muck or the cold or whatever it might be. One of the things we know from across the globe, when people are presented with the opportunity to move to cities, work in factories, under a roof, indoors, they will almost always take it. The migration from the countryside to the city in the face of the increased opportunities in the city, and what that does, for example, to the choices families make. They begin to have fewer kids, for example, because they don't need them to work on the farm, right? Undergoes this tremendous demographic transition that takes place as urbanization and industrialization take place. And even though the conditions of the Industrial Revolution certainly were unpleasant, the two things to remember were, one, they were less unpleasant than what came before, and second, they created opportunities for people and families to improve their lives in quick and dramatic ways that people were unwilling to pass up. To enable your children to work indoors and eventually not work at all, right? But by the time the 20th century rolled around, was a huge opportunity, and families took advantage of that. So when we think about the Industrial Revolution, we have to think about it in both the sort of whole picture and think about what was the opportunity cost, what was the alternative, but also what was the long run effects. And here we are today living the long-run effects of the benefits produced by the Industrial Revolution. So economic growth is a key topic as we think about economics in general, macroeconomics in particular. What we know about it is that human capital, physical capital, technological knowledge are key. But what produces those? What produces those are having good institutions that create the right incentives that enable us to organize that physical and human capital and knowledge in ways that produce goods and services that benefit people across the board. And again, the most striking thing that you can say about the last 250 years or so of human history is the degree to which we are beginning to overcome poverty, and the degree to which average people live a lot better today than they did 200 years ago.